Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Haddon, and I'm the publisher of Corporate Compliance Insights, and absolutely delighted that you have joined us here today as we discuss LRN's 2025 Compliance and Ethics Program Effectiveness Report. Joining me today is Ty Francis. Ty is the Chief Advisory Officer for LRN. He is the architect of the research that we will be discussing, and he's also the author of the report. Ty Francis, will you join me, please, on the stage? And there you are. Welcome.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing so well, and I'm so excited to be talking about the program effectiveness report. I know that this study is 10 years in the making. That means LRN has spent a decade asking these important questions about program effectiveness. And you can't do anything for 10 years without learning a thing or two. And obviously, there's always been some kind of a gap in between an effective program and an ineffective program. But this year, we're seeing that that gap is widening.
Yes, indeed. So the uh, the evolution of this report has gone through three stages, and what we've been doing, we've been consistently surveying about 1,500 people around the world, compliance professionals, about the state of their compliance programs, trends they're seeing, and how effective their programs are within the organizations. Um, when we first did this, it was more of an outlook and an overview. Then in 2021, we changed it to include some very distinct and benchmarkable questions. So then we could review year on year to see how we think organizations have changed. We also decided to kind of make it more consistent rather than having the COVID special or
Mhm.
the real estate special. So what we changed this year, which was our biggest change, is we included survey respondents from employees of organizations. So we had 1,500 compliance professionals and we had 1,500 employee responses. So we had this direct juxtaposition of the compliance professionals' perspective and the employees' perspective. And that's where we've seen a lot of these changes. And a lot of the questions we've asked this year have been in response to some other survey questions we've asked over the few years to make sure that we're consistent in what we're seeing. And as you said, the gaps are widening amongst what we call high impact programs and medium impact programs. And to give you a little bit of context on what we mean by that, is we ask about 8 to 10 questions within organizations, and that includes organizational justice. It includes ethical decision making. Are people making decisions based on values or based on expediency? We look at organizational justice. Are employees and employers, do they feel they're treated equally in the organization? Do they feel there's organizational justice? And also, is there freedom of expression? And so we ask a number of questions around those. And when we get the responses, we then put those into kind of 3 categories: high impact, medium impact, and low impact programs. And what we're seeing is those that we deem high impact programs, the gaps between medium impact programs are widening year on year. And some of the findings we've seen this year, it's the largest gap we've seen to date.
The largest gap to date. Well, that certainly warrants further discussion. I know we'll go into that some more today. But in the spirit of asking questions, I'd love to just pop out a poll question for our viewers right now to get a sense of where is your program right now? How are you really feeling about your program maturity? We're going to have that poll appear on the screen. And if you would locate the controls on your screen to respond and give us an idea whether you are just getting started, you're building structure and consistency, your program is established with ongoing improvements, or perhaps you are mature and optimizing. So, Ty, there are some key findings that I know you know by that like the back of your hand now. You spend so much time talking about them, but I would love for you to go into some more detail and just lay those out and unpack them before our panelists join us. Our panelists are waiting backstage. We'll bring them back on afterwards. It looks like the poll is clicking along, but let's go ahead and have the background slide that you'll be speaking to, Ty, to discuss those key findings.
Sure. And just to kind of, again, put some more context into this. So the report we ran this report in October. The surveys went out in October last year. So a couple of things may be missed. And so for some context, For example, in late September, the DOJ came out and asked companies to be more rigid with their supply chain and due diligence. And so some of these questions may not reflect immediate changes from the DOJ in September. Also, this report, I would love to take full credit, but I absolutely can't. The report was authored by my advisory team and in conjunction with our marketing team led by Amy Hannon. And this was really a team effort. I mean, my team had gone through, days and days and weeks sifting through this information. So I'm just the steward of this project. So when we look at the findings, obviously these are benchmarked based on years prior. One of the biggest findings we found was the benchmarking gap between those high impact programs and those medium impact programs has grown to about 1.9 times. With really high impact programs nearly twice as likely to use benchmarking data, reporting data, and leveraging those advanced tools, including data analytics, to manage their compliance programs. And on top of that, those high impact programs were also 1.3 times more likely to report those findings to their boards. Again, showing their ability to use that just-in-time data, longitudinal data. And remember, the benchmarking data isn't just about their own companies. They're looking at peer data as well. So for context, am I doing the same things as my competitors or companies within that same sphere? Second, we looked at the perception gap regarding middle management. We call this caught in the middle because we're really seeing a massive divide between leadership and middle management. People call it tone from the middle. I think tone from the top has been talked about for decades now, and I think senior leadership have finally got where they need to be. Their codes of conduct have CEO messaging, their proxy reports, their annual statements have all got this very clear values-driven messaging. But what we're finding is that messaging isn't cascading throughout the organization the way it should be, and we feel that that messaging is being caught in the middle. We found that there was a 2 times gap between the positive perceptions of where middle management say they're making decisions based on their company values and the perception of executives when they are asked the same question: are you leading with values when it comes to difficult choices? So this year, middle management reported that they were doing that 37%, leadership by 79%, which demonstrates a 42 point gap. And it's the largest it's been since we kind of asked this question. And this is from even when we asked the question during COVID. The overview of this is some organizations, not all, leadership have a very rosy look at how their organizations are doing. I think COVID really brought this to attention, where when we asked questions in a culture survey back then, we asked questions for senior leadership, senior management, middle management, junior management, all the way down to frontline workers. And we asked the same questions, do you feel pressure to do your job? Do you feel that your organization is responding well to changes? And senior management always had the best kind of overview and feeling about what was happening. And when we asked down the chain, it was less and less and less and less until you got to frontline workers who were really responding that they didn't feel that senior management or the board understood or saw what was happening with the organizations. So we wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper to find out if that was true and what was the problem. The third point, again, it goes back to this data and analytics discussion that we've been having for years at LRN, and why we kind of tailor everything around the use of data, and not just data for data's sake, but just-in-time data. Is the use of misconduct trend analysis. And we found that for these high-impact programs, 63% of high-impact programs were using misconduct trend analysis, whereas medium impact programs, this is not low, this is just even medium, only reported that 33% of them were using this kind of misconduct trend analysis. And we're talking about nearly a 2 times gap here. So these medium impact programs are not really using this longitudinal data to find out where misconduct's happening in comparison to year on year, quarter on quarter, or to where their peers are doing. The fourth kind of bit of data we found, and this was probably, even though it was more amalgamous, this was the kind of most popular bit of the data when we talked about Generation Z, and it was the emerging gap between different generations. particular with employees who we designated as Generation Z. And they were twice as likely to report skepticism regarding managerial fairness and conduct. Again, this ties back to research we did last year in our ethical benchmarking report, where we saw that Gen Z were twice as likely to have kind of done something against their code of conduct than Generation X or Boomers, and they were 1 times more likely to have kind of ignored a policy or procedure compared to their two older generations. And there's lots of data around that, and this I'm sure will be a very kind of intense discussion. And the last thing was surprising again when we're talking about the onset of AI. The European regulators looking at supply chain regulatory, management with CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act, and even as we said, the DOJ's statement coming out in September last year about more due diligence and periodic reviews, where we saw a kind of lack of focus on emerging risks, and that includes third-party due diligence, supply chain compliance, and also the adoption of AI. And again, medium impact programs were lagging behind those high impact programs in very, very large rates.
Wow. So the gap is real.
The gap is real, Sarah.
A lot to unpack here. I would like to have our panelists join us on the stage. We're going to be welcoming today Juliana Molina with Zoll Medical, Jenna Voss representing Forensic Risk Alliance, and Felipe Garcia with Salesforce. And as they come on stage, I also want to acknowledge that we asked that important question about what do you think about the maturity of your program, but we failed to linger over those results. So perhaps I could have that slide as well. The results of the poll. I'm not seeing the results just yet. We may need to pop back and visit that later. All right, well, let's welcome our panel then. And there we go. Okay, we are all on stage and ready to dig into these reports. It's so interesting, I think, that benchmarking emerges as one of the most key findings, the actual lack of benchmarking. But Ty, could you kick us off, please, by talking about the difference between internal benchmarking and external benchmarking? You had drawn that important distinction.
Yeah, so, everyone wants to, compare themselves to the year prior or the quarter prior. I mean, that's just how we measure things. I want to see how much weight I've gained since last Christmas, So, but I think an important thing as well is finding out, if other people who are 6'1" and 240 pounds have also gained the same amount of weight doing the same kind of thing. Because I want to say, is it just me or is it everyone else? Is it the market that's affecting this, or is it just me, overcompensating with Oreos? So when we look at companies, it's important to know that you're asking the same questions. And that's the important thing with benchmarking. And companies can understand how they're using data year on year, quarter on quarter. Finding out what your competitors are doing or your peer groups are doing is as important. Now, we all understand that, every company is a snowflake. They're all unique and they all do different things. You could use the example of Coke and Pepsi. They're both soft drink manufacturers, right? But they have vastly different distribution channels. They have different locations and ways of doing business. But as a chief compliance officer with a similar sized company, you'd want to know, okay, how are they dealing with X? What is their speak up kind of culture in their organization? How much time each employee spending in seat when they're doing their training? So, various kind of things. And when we looked at this question within the survey, we asked the question, how useful are the programs? Is your program's impact for identifying areas of improvement? And the leading question was benchmarking against other organizations' ethics compliance programs. Well, high impact programs said that 52% of them were likely to benchmark against a peer company, whereas a medium impact program, 28%. So again, a high impact program was 1.8 times more likely to benchmark against a peer organization. Then we asked another question. It was, what methods do you use to measure training effectiveness impact? And again, we asked that leading question, are you using benchmarking against other companies' ethics compliance training? High impact programs said that 36% of them were doing that. compared to medium impact programs, which is 24%. So again, high impact programs are 1.5 times more likely to use that benchmarking data to kind of compare themselves contextually against other organizations.
Right, right. The value of benchmarking data appears to be so clear, and yet here we have organizations so clearly not taking advantage of it. What are some of those challenges? That this question to our panel: why, in spite of the value, would organizations not take advantage of benchmarking data?
Hi, this is Juliana. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Um, I just want to point one thing based on the discussion that we are having. I also have noticed that high impact programs maybe perform a little bit different because they are also more mature, right? In terms of low impact programs. So again, depending on the size of the organization, if the organization is under scrutiny or not, I think they're going to use benchmark for one purpose or another. And and also, despite of having a lot of information out there, available, many people struggle to leverage the benchmark data effectively. And I think Gina can contribute a lot on that. We were having this discussion before, that sometimes you don't know how to collect the data, right, Gina? What data to collect, how to draw the insights from the data you collected. So I don't know if Gina, you want to share something on this, but like we were having this discussion, sometimes you have a lot of data out there and you just don't know where to begin, right? Especially depending on where you are in the maturity curve of your compliance program.
Yeah, I think that's so true that companies often have a hard time figuring out there's vast volumes of data out there, both externally and internally. How can you find where that data is? How can you leverage that? And how can you really bring that into the program? I think a lot of the challenge is knowing where to get started. So if you want to have a robust data analytics function, which I really think is a strong indicator of the strength of a program, what tools should you be using? And do you have individuals who know how to use those tools? That can be a big challenge because you have individuals who are extremely capable, competent, and brilliant at compliance. But if they don't know how to use those tools that you're going to deploy for data analytics, that's a challenge. And similarly, you may bring in data analytics experts who don't know how to apply that compliance lens. So I think it's about finding the right tools, understanding how to resource the analytics function so that you can really draw those insights. And then it's about understanding what data is available. Where's the data stored? How are you able to integrate that? Looking internally, there can be a lot of challenges with gathering data from different sources. I've seen companies where they've grown through acquisition over the years and they have global operations. And so they may have ERP systems in all of their different locations around the world. And so that requires someone going to each location and figuring out how to draw that data into one central repository. Obviously, companies that are a little bit more advanced and have everything already sitting in one central repository, they're much further along in being able to draw in that data. And then it's really being able to know what you want to do with the data. And some of the best programs I've seen are really good at using data to understand what their risks are. So evaluating those risks, bringing the data into the risk assessment process, using the data to perform transaction monitoring across the high-risk transactions to be able to flag trends and anomalies as soon as those pop up, and then creating dashboards and reporting that can speak to executives and those in the business function to really help educate them about the risks.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it would seem that once you have all this wonderful data at your fingertips, there's the potential to really change the kinds of conversations you're having with company leadership or with the board. Is that true?
That's really true from what I've seen as an external advisor, but I would also be interested in hearing the in-house perspective on how those conversations have gone.
Yes, and I think that also strengthens the argument with the leadership, right? One thing that I do want to highlight is that sometimes we also have a constraint with resources, right? We may have all the good data, all the good information. We may start using the tools, but then it comes back to budget or headcounts, and that also become the challenge. What I have seen internally, from different companies, I have changed the industries from telecommunications, transportation, logistics. Now I'm in healthcare. um, I have been consultant as well, is that internally benchmark data can be very powerful tool to,
Mhm.
again, to convince leadership And I can give you a very simple example. It doesn't have to be that sophisticated, Sarah. We were doing a third-party code of conduct as an example, and very simple, basic. And I said, how should I convince the company that we need one, right? So I went out there. We look what the peers were doing, what the industry were doing. We checked like what topics they were covering, what topics they were not covering, the reasons why, what were the risks that we as a company were facing. And to be very, very honest, that kind of data-driven benchmark offered a concrete evidence to support the work my team did, you know, for the changes in the additional resource. So again, I'm talking about an external benchmark, but that I used very simple way to use that I used to convert it internally. So I don't know if that helps, but also showing you how we can, with very little resource, use the data that is available out there, additional to the internal benchmark, which we usually use to improve the efficiency of our program.
So in other words, don't just take my word for it. Here are the
Yeah.
numbers to back me up. Yeah, that must have been a very satisfying moment in your week or in your quarter.
Yes.
It's a real problem because, from what Juliana's saying, it's a catch-22, right? So, when you look at these medium impact programs, the reason we denote that way is because they have this inefficient resource allocation because they don't have the data to prioritize high risk areas. So they kind of use suboptimal use of resources, right? So then they have inconsistent performance based on that. But if they had the proper data at the right time, they could do that. But it's this, well, we don't have the resources to be able to collate that data. Because Jenna said, no, everyone has data, but it's how you're using that data and really directing it. Because otherwise you become very reactive to all these compliance needs and you're kind of looking back all the time. So it's like, you're rather than preventing fraud happening, you're kind of attacking the fraud after it's happened. So you're kind of playing catch up all the time.
And it's that example of that saying, right? The neighbor's green is always greener, right? The neighbor's grass is always greener. So it's like sometimes you have to convince the leadership that it's not just, you don't need to just believe me because I'm here, you're a compliance professional, but I'll bring you some benchmark data. And in some places, that's how you're gonna get some convincing to happen with the leadership, right? I've had situations in my career where executives will come to me, prove me that third parties can put me in trouble. I don't believe you. So, okay, that's gonna be very fun to prove, right? And that's easy, right? But so it all depends as well on the level of sophistication and understanding of what really can be a problem, what really matters on a compliance program and how that affects the company. That's why I defend the idea that compliance professionals, we need to position ourselves as business partners. We're not the police, we're not the judge. We need to understand the business. We need to be part of the business. We need to be where the business is happening and have a seat on the table, right? So that people respect us, understand that we are not there to just stop things from happening. We're there to say yes and how, and eventually they're gonna have to say no and why not. But the goal is always to say, I defend this idea that it's always a two-piece answer. If someone comes to me, it's a yes and how, or no and why not. It's not only about the yes or no, because that doesn't create knowledge with people. And my point is that it's all about people, and we need to create this knowledge every single time with them. Why that matters? Why we're advising in a given way. People want to be pleased. They want the yes and nothing else. But it's important we try to advise them on the extra piece of the answer. And the benchmark is, I find it extremely helpful, and that's something that boards will ask for. They want to know how we compare to. But I find that the real challenge is really within the companies, not really at the board level. That people sometimes they have not a great understanding, especially in smaller companies where they have not been exposed to compliance significantly. They might not really understand how that compares. So that plays an extra valuable data points to share.
It does, doesn't it? Felipe, you referenced a moment ago the importance of the dynamics between people in the organization, leadership and not leadership. Let's unpack that now. Let's look at that disconnect between leaders and the front line. Ty, can you just set that up for us, if you would, please?
Yeah, so like I said in some of the opening statements I made, we've been tracking this leadership disconnect for a number of years now, and this year it's become the largest. And just to recap on how we kind of ask these questions. So one of the questions was, what steps has your organization made to respond to compliance risk and challenges over the last 12 months? And the leading question was, have you made difficult decisions consistent with your company's values and purpose? So when we asked executive leadership, 79% said yes, we have made difficult decisions based on our company's values. But when we asked middle management, they said only 37% said that, which is that 42% gap. Last year, I think it was 37%, and then it went all the way down to during COVID. Actually, middle management were kind of dealing with it a lot better, I think, because they were like on the ground and they were really interacting with their frontline workers, and there was a 23% gap there. So it's the perception of ethical standards, right? It's about how alignment is happening with organizational values and how it's varying significantly across different levels of the workforce. And I think that's what we're trying to tackle. And when we ask some of these questions about organizational justice, we're asking questions like, are top performers held to the same standard as everyone else? Do managers hold themselves to the same standards as well? And so when you compare those two results, you start to see I would love to, follow my code, but I've also got a lot of pressure to complete this quarter's results. And I've got a list of priorities that I've got to kind of go through now that I just haven't got time to do that. And senior leadership, obviously, when they're creating these rules and policies, they're just kind of pushing them down and getting on to the next priority for them. So that's why, and I think it's going to be particularly interesting to hear from Juliana and Felipe, because they've worked at a completely different set of organizations, with tech to medical to transport logistics. But I also want to hear from Janet, because she's come from the outside, consulting inside these companies to kind of see how you can bridge that gap. So, again, the data we created and produced was just the perception that we've seen. So, this is the time to hear from practitioners to say, okay, I agree, but this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, Jenna, let's start with you, because I know in your work as a consultant, you have had to conduct these kinds of assessments that really look at these disconnects, right?
Yeah, we often look at these types of disconnects either with a company that's asking us to come in and perform a proactive assessment, or else more reactively in the context of independent compliance monitorships. And typically we go about conducting the assessment by talking to a series of employees in different locations, across different functions, and across different levels to really dig into and get their candid, or hopefully candid, views on what the organization is all about. So what are the organizational values? How do they see themselves and others carrying out those values day to day? And then ultimately, if they do see misconduct, do they know where to report that? Do they feel that that would be taken seriously? And do they feel that the organization has strong anti-retaliation policies in place? And so the interviews we think are a really rich source of data. But then we're also looking at what mechanisms do companies have in place to reinforce culture and to ensure that individuals know what the expectations are. I think that piece about understanding the expectations is so important. And sometimes companies aren't laying that out very clearly in the code of conduct or through compliance messaging. And with the compliance messaging, it's really important that companies are looking at, is that message being received by the individuals that they're trying to reach? Are they going out in a variety of different manners to deliver the messaging? So for example, it's not enough just to put up a web page banner. Those leaders need to be talking to individuals throughout the organization. There need to be town halls, written communications, and then they need to have different mechanisms in place for measuring the effectiveness of those. Another one that I'm really big on is conducting ongoing surveys of employees across levels and functions to really understand what the perception is of the culture and the challenges that the organization faces. So when we look at these, we're looking at, is the company asking the same questions year over year? And then once they get those results, what are they doing with that data? Kind of going back to some of my comments before, you really need to be understanding what you're gathering the data for and how you're going to take action on it. And to me, best practices are looking at the data set as a whole, for some outliers, but then also digging in and having the ability to slice and dice that to see, are there specific functions where there's a different perception of the tone at the top or the tone at the middle? Or are there certain managers, for example, where the team is feeling perhaps some concerns around psychological safety?
That's such a key component of that. Perspectives from our in-house panelists?
Yes, I think also something that Philip and I were discussing the other day, it's about the perception of the management, and he can talk more about that as well from where he sits, right? But there is this perception that senior leaders are not held accountable with the same standards as middle managers and below. And I think that comes down to Jenna's point on how the culture of the organization is and how they are seeing and evaluating and hearing their employees, right? So again, I think one effective way to bridge this gap is by publicizing information more broadly within the company. If I'm really honest, low level employees often have less access, right, to big decisions and really company-wide initiatives. And I think town halls, as Jenna said, dashboards, newsletter is great. Some front lines don't have access to internet, so how are you communicating with those? I've come from a company where talking points were something used. I have seen middle managers, believe it or not, kind of training um, the leadership, so the other way around, instead of having the top from the top training the middle managers, having the middle managers training the leaders. And I think that also helps, again, for the to improve a perception, right, that actions are not taking at the same level of the organization.
And I would add that it's important to realize that different companies are going to have different realities, and there's no one size fits all approach, right? And I'm sure Jenna sees that all the time in her practice as well, that every company is going to be different. I'm right now at Salesforce, big tech company, multiple countries, very kind of sophisticated personnel, I would say. But before I was in a company which a lot of what normally called blue collar workflows in with where employees were not that sophisticated, where things were much more simple. So the challenges are different, and the perception of who is top management, who is middle management is different. Right. I remember going to to down to manufacturing sites in South America and talking to people who, for them, the top management of the company was their manager's manager, right? That's so their skip level was for them. That's all the perspective they have about top management of the company. Some people, I remember having this conversation with employees, and it was a company that acquired a lot of businesses in South America, and you would ask them, "What company do you work for?" They would still refer to the old name that didn't exist for like 5-6 years already. But in their mind, they had no understanding that there was an acquisition, that they were no longer part of that local company in whatever country, but they were now part of a bigger corporation, which was, happened to be in an FCPA investigation, what that meant. And sometimes I remember going for training, to give out training to people. And after the training, people come up to me and say, "Hey, for the first time now, we're understanding what's happening here because someone came and talked to us in plain language, not in legalese." So, and I'm not an attorney. I respect a lot
Don't go
the
there.
attorneys doing compliance, right? But I'm not an attorney, and I can be effective, right? So, and the idea is that you need to understand the business. You need to understand the company. In this company I'm referring to, I remember we created a very simple dashboard that would go to every single site, every single team, every month with only 3 basic metrics about the Speak Up program. The idea was to show that cases were being brought up, so people were speaking up, cases were being investigated, and there were consequences for those, right? And all anonymized, all global data, very simple charts, but every month we were publishing that internally. And that would go for every employee. And for employees with email, they would receive that email, but 70% of the workforce did not have email access. So we would print those out, have them in the boards, and we provide materials for the leaders, to the supervisors and the plant leaders to discuss that with their teams. And because that was the challenge in that population, was to be in front of them, to have the message in front of them. Come to Salesforce, my challenge is not to be in front of people. I can send a message right now on Slack that reaches everyone in the company. My challenge is engagement. My challenge is, how can I make sure that people are going to care about my message, that they're going to read and click on that channel and read my message? So the challenge is different. And if you don't realize how different the reality of the different companies are, you might be missing the boat on that. And then you're just doing something that might not be effective. So if you want to be effective, you need to understand the business you are at. You need to understand who middle management is for those people, because who you might think as middle management, for some people, they might be their top management in their perspective.
Someone else entirely. I think that's so interesting, remarkable, really, that in your previous organization, you took such pains to make sure that you got that message out to everyone, not just that the speaker hotline exists, but that incidents have been received and they are being dealt with. And that really segues nicely into our next benchmark finding that we'll be discussing, which is regarding misconduct trend analysis. To me, it just seems if you've got data about what's going wrong in your company, what the misconduct is, why would you not learn from that? Why would you not share that? But that's not always happening, right, Ty?
Well, look, this is a tricky one. It goes back to what we've been talking about the lack or thereof of access to this data and where it is, and understanding where it lives and how it can be used. We started talking about misconduct trend reporting last year in our kind of a big culture survey. That's what we brought this into here. I think everyone agrees that there's misconduct in every company, everywhere, no matter how great we think our companies are. I was with a group of directors of public boards a couple of years ago, and one of them said a very poignant thing. And I say this in a lot of speeches I give, where he said there is no town in America with 100,000 people and no one's in jail. Right. So I think we understand that. And even when we ask the question, have I observed employee misconduct or unethical behavior in the last 12 months, whether it was strong, moderate, or weak cultures and organizations, it was about 30%, 31, 30, 38%. So a third of organizations said that, yes, we've seen misconduct, right? The trick was when we asked the next question, if yes, did you report this misconduct or unethical behavior? So companies with strong values and strong kind of cultures, 93% of those people said, yes, I reported this misconduct. When you go down to moderate, it was 84%. And then companies with weak cultures were 63%. So what you're saying is over a third of employees who witness misconduct in companies with weak cultures aren't reporting it. So we've got two issues here. One, we've got the misconduct data that we are encouraging employees and companies to use to benchmark to see how they're doing. But then there's an entirely different kind of factor where you've got some companies that over a third of them aren't reporting the data at all. So you've got this huge risk of this misconduct going unreported, unnoticed. And how do we as organizations, compliance professionals, encourage people to not just report that, but feel safe in doing so? And like Felipe said before, give them access to channels that they can do it efficiently, and with a certain level of anonymity.
Well, can I just say something here to add to one thing that I've mentioned? When we were having the discussion prior to this, Jean and I also came to very similar conclusions. In what sense? There are still companies out there, believe it or not, that believes the fact that you are not receiving an alert line, ethics line, a hotline, whatever you call it, means there is nothing to report. There is no situation out there, and that's great. That means the program is working. And I think that is very basic compliance 101. And all of us in this call probably would agree that that's actually the opposite. Right? So
Right.
I think that that's something important to highlight, just because again, Gina comes from a consultant points of view, and Felipe and I from internal, from different companies, right? And there are some misperceptions as well on how you manage and you do the analysis on the misconduct and how the misconduct happened. The fact that they are not happening or they haven't been reported means the program is working, right? And the second thing, and I will let my colleagues to chime in, is root cause analysis. How many of you know companies that do root cause analysis on misconduct analysis? Not just the trend and the usual report that you report to the board with the metrics of how many, reports you received, what type of reports, but how many companies for high impact and low impact have you seen that analyzes the root cause analysis of those misconducts in the first place?
To learn from it. Yeah.
To learn from,
Yeah.
because usually we report the metrics, right? And that's how we do the misconduct analysis most of the time, including to the board. But how do we do root cause analysis to understand why? What was the motive behind?
Probing weak spots.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Root cause analysis
Yeah.
always make me think about my engineering days. We were on manufacturing environments, and that discussion was always that if you really address the root cause of something, that's not going to happen again. If it
Mhm.
happens again, that's because you did not address the actual root cause. You may have thought that that was the root cause. It was not. If it happens again, the root cause is still there, hanging in there. And it's very important. Right? But I think it's one. I look at this hotline data sometimes, right? And I see companies that still don't look into, like, they say, oh, what Juliana was saying is perfect. That still there are companies that think that no reports is good. That's not. Should rethink that. But and then you see, oh, you see, in this country we have so many reports, so it's good, right? Now I understand no reports is not good. So a good number of reports might be a good indication something is happening there. People feel comfortable reporting. Said, yeah, that's the starting point. Let's look at the next step. How are people reporting this? Are they anonymous? Because if there are a lot of reports, but majority of them are anonymous, to me, that's a sign that they are concerned about being identified. So they're concerned about retaliation, which is one of the great evils on a Speak Up program. So I think and that is something to be always mindful of. Right? So it's important we look the data, whatever data we have, and there's a lot of data in our companies for all things, including compliance, but we need to make the data become information for decision making to drive our program. Otherwise, it's just data. Right? So you have these two pieces of data, and you connect them, and you find some relation between them, and try to understand that. I think it's very important that it's not only about do you know about misconduct? Would you report? If you reported, was it investigated? Right? Do you think it was fairly investigated? We have our employee survey every year, a broad employee survey at the company. We have some questions about ethics. Those questions that are never compromised, they're always there. Our survey happens twice a year. You say, oh, twice a year? Yes, we find it's really important, and we get over 90% participation from our employees in our survey twice a year. Because for us, it's something that we stress a lot, we talk a lot about, and we make it very sound and be very important to our people. We take actions, we discuss the results of the survey, something that Jenna was saying earlier, right? So we find that it's not just a show. We want to do something meaningful about it, right? So every employee has access to the results of the survey. It's just any employee, they can just go there, search whatever cycle of the survey, whatever year, it's all available to all employees. We believe in the transparency of that data. So it's doing some of those things, we believe that we are contributing to building this culture that it's safe to speak up and to voice your concerns and to ask questions, and therefore build an ethical culture as part of that.
That's so important what you just said about every person in the organization having access. But what happens when the boards, what happens when the people at the very top of the company don't ever even see those reports? Jenna, you had made a comment about that before this call.
Yeah, since I'm the data nerd, I was digging into the back of the report and looking at all the really rich data points that the team had collected. Um, and I was really surprised to see that only 33% of the respondents indicated that their boards receive and review hotline cases and statistics. I guess surprised in the context of everything else where companies are at different stages of their journey. But that's something that I think really should be a lot higher. That's a very quick win to get that information in front of the board. And the board really should be asking for that too. As a best practice, I've seen some companies do this really well, where it's a standing topic at their audit committee meetings quarterly, and they're talking about the trends and they're having to explain anomalies. So to the points Felipe and Juliana made, there's eyes on those metrics. There's someone really digging in, and if you're getting 0 complaints in a certain region, you're having to answer why. And there's really simple reasons that you may not have complaints coming up in a region, and usually it has nothing to do with the fact that there is actually no misconduct there. So I've seen the cultural differences in different countries, as well as the lower psychological safety at different locations. But it could also be something simple as, do you have that hotline actually working? Has anybody tested that someone answers when you make the phone call? And do you have that hotline available at a phone number that individuals can reach in their local jurisdictions? Because it's a huge barrier for someone to look at a number that's a foreign number and feel comfortable knowing how to dial that and actually getting the phone to work to be able to make that hotline report. And then, is that hotline accessible in all the different languages that your employees speak? I've
Oh,
seen
it's
that can also be a huge barrier.
critical to review those technical aspects as well, isn't it? We have a question from one of our viewers. Let me relay this to the group. Regarding the root cause analysis discussion, how does the panel view the importance of collaboration between compliance, internal controls, and internal audit to boost the control environment and prevent recurring issues?
I think it's critical. I think it's very important. It's no one is the owner of the truth. Uh, it's a team sport, and compliance is not the only group of people responsible for compliance in the company. We set the strategy, we kind of operate it, but it's everyone's job. It's a team sport, and when it comes to that, I mean, it's absolutely important that we collaborate with other groups and leverage their skill set. And depending on the situation, you might need to loop in different groups, right? And it's important that we know that who we can reach out to, that they understand the role, that they understand the importance of that. It's not just to a check the box exercise. Otherwise, you don't address the root cause. Right. So I think it's super important. It's not always easy. I'll acknowledge that. Sometimes, especially depending on the maturity of your program and your company, people might say, "This is not my job. I'm doing you a favor." This is not a favor.
Right.
It is actually part of the job. So you need to frame that properly. And sometimes, C-level to C-level folks might need to be having that type of conversation and understand that, hey, we need to work together on this. We're not competing. We're not trying to point fingers and blame each other. We're trying to solve a problem that is the company's problem. Right? It's
Exactly.
not a compliance problem. It's not a legal problem. It's not a finance problem. It's the company's problem.
We all have the
So
same.
yeah,
I-
right. So I
Ye-
think it's you have to go that way. But I acknowledge it's not straightforward sometimes.
Mhm.
And I would also add that the investigations team, to the extent that it's not compliance involved, the investigations team should also be performing those root cause analyses when something goes
Yes.
wrong. But it should be an internal audits, everyday approach to their business as usual audits, even when those aren't compliance related. So to me, the most effective organizations are doing this across the board and in different functions and in different contexts.
One
And,
of the
and
challenges, oh, excuse me, go ahead, please.
no, Sarah, one last thing that I was going to say is that I've used investigations reports and root cause analysis to strengthen actually internal controls or create internal controls that were missing for organization. So I think again the exercise of the root cause analysis, which I don't think it's done in every single organization, I think it's something important to be considered, especially if you want to have that collaboration, that the one of our attendees just asked, you can use that root cause analysis to improve your control environment and work with internal controls, to work with internal audit team, to ask them to test, to do some testing on the area that you feel you need to have some improvement, and really to help your compliance program to improve effectiveness as well. I'm wrapping up here, Sarah. Sorry.
Well, I just keep thinking about the generational divide as being yet another challenge to exactly what you're describing. Felipe was speaking about how important it is that we involve every member of the organization and that we communicate really directly. But what about those generational differences that blunt that communication and cause other problems?
I think we're missing a trick by not analyzing those different risk areas. The same way we'd say, okay, I'm going to treat China differently to the Middle East. I'm going to treat differently to the UK, to South America. We all look at these regional areas with different risk tolerances. And I don't think we're really looking at the generational kind of divides in our organizations with the same level of scrutiny. Part of our research talks about that in kind of detail when we said that, I think 50% of Gen Z workers believe they're less than 50% of the Gen Z workers believe their managers hold themselves to the same ethical standards of others. And that was the lowest percentage score across any of the generations. They also said that they scored the lowest for when they asked the question, employees in my organization voice their opinions in team meetings, even in front of managers. So again, some of these cohorts of generations are finding it hard to kind of react the same way as we all did. When we looked at the data I talked about before, where Gen Z were twice as likely to say that they've broken a rule in their code of conduct than Gen X. This is a real thing. And part of this problem is because in general, because this is why we did the employee perception survey as well, is that Gen Z don't feel they were part of the decision-making process when these rules came out. I think Gen X, as a Gen Xer, we kind of grown up in these organizations or these structures and kind of taken it for granted that these are the rules and this is how we follow them. Gen Z have a completely different approach to this. They have a different approach to learning, how they intake information and content, how they view the world, how they view their values. They want to align their values to an organization's values, and they're very critical of that. And they're very critical of calling out leadership, publicly to say, you don't represent what you say you do. And so if you add that all together, this generation of people are going to be questioning these rules. There's, no difference to when my daughter will say to me, why do I have to do that? Whether it's, if I said to a friend of mine, oh, don't do that, they go, okay.
Exactly.
Okay, well, Ty must know what he's talking about. So yeah, but my daughter's like, nah, I don't, why was that rule made up? And I don't think it applies to me. So even though those are extreme things, our data is kind of telling us that there's a big gap between what someone in the Gen Z generation will react to and how they'll respond to a baby boom or Gen X.
And we ignore that at our peril. I mean, it seems like the public discourse about generational divides, it's, we roll our eyes and we criticize the whippersnappers and that sort of thing. But in order to future-proof we have to acknowledge that there are differences in perceptions and differences in the ways that we need to communicate. How are you seeing this in your organizations? A question to our in-house professionals.
For us, it's we have a lot of Gen Z, right? It's a tech company, a lot of very young professionals, very bright professionals, and we try to adjust to that reality. It's not perfect, of course, but just something like Ty was alluding to, the idea that they're going to be questioning, they're going to be criticizing that. Well, we have this. If you look at and thankfully no one has access to that, but internally, we look at these channels in Slack. People are talking to the CEO all the time and to the leaders, and it's a very live conversation. So they understand the role in a different way, right? And that's fine. And we as compliance professionals, we need to take advantage of that and see how we can connect with them in a more effective way, and how we can leverage their energy, their approach, their different take on things than we older people like myself. So I think it's important, right, Ty? So I think it's important that we make that in our benefit. But it's important also that we understand that it is different. Just closing an eye and pretending it's not happening, generational divide is not happening, is not going to help us, right? So I think it's important, but it's another aspect that it's easier said than done. And I think that it's really powerful if we tell people what you expect from them. We just did a recent exercise in partnership with LRN, actually, to launch a brand new code of conduct for Salesforce. I invite you all to take a look at that. It's so much more connected to that generation in all aspects: the language, the visuals, the examples, the accessibility. And guess what? People are providing us good feedback on that. So the simple details matter, right? And for us, I mean, I tell people the code of conduct is the most important document in the whole company. And some people call me crazy because I say that, but I believe in that, right? So we wanted it took us a while, but we got a fine product, and I believe it's something to start with in terms of communicating expectations, what good looks like, what expectations we have from them, and then have them voice their concerns, their criticisms, their feedback.
Other in-house perspectives?
No, I think the generation divide is really a challenge to all organization, even to the people who belongs to the organization, right? One thing that in my experience, and I'm not talking on behalf of my company here, but in my experience, I think focusing on transparency, involving employees in decision-making processes where possible, of course, and perhaps demonstrating fairness, in action, may be some of key strategies that could resonate with these younger generations, and possibly ensure alignment across the workforce. But again, I don't think there is a right wrong answer here. I think that is still a challenge to all companies. Everyone is almost in the US rebranding their DEI, initiative, for several different reasons. I think understanding the generations out also applies to that.
It does, doesn't it? This is such a deep, rich topic. I would love to devote an entire hour just to unpacking the generational divides. Unfortunately, we are coming up on the 1 hour mark, and I want to make sure that we do look at some of the persistent challenges and some of the emerging risks. And I do have a question from a viewer regarding one emerging risk, which this will come as no surprise, is the use of AI. So this question to our panel: with most compliance trainings now virtual, what is the panel's view on using AI agents to enhance training delivery? What are the key benefits and the potential risks of adopting this approach? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, look, I can give it an overview of what our report was saying is that, that this is a real issue. When we asked how much of your program, are you going to expend on using artificial intelligence, only 47% of even high impact programs said they were, with 21% of medium impacts and 15% of low impact programs. It's an issue. I think AI is great to help enhance as a time saver. I think companies need to be very clear about how they're using AI. And we're talking, Juliana's talking about transparency, being transparent how are you using AI and the benefits of using the AI, but also alerting people to the risks of that as well.
Yeah, and I think just to say something here, not talking about training specifically, but I think before even going to which of course there are many values of using AI, right, for trainings, even reviewing policies and etc. There are some companies that are taking very conservative approach, right? And maybe Gina can wrap up on this, but if you don't understand the risks, you may not use it as much, right? Because nobody really knows what the risks are. And I think that's where the challenge is. There are some companies, depending on the industry, that are more open to use AI, and there are others that are not, despite of being applied for trainings or not. So
Absolutely. We are just about at that 1 hour mark. I do want to acknowledge that one of the persistent challenges was outdated internal systems and complex regulatory environments. Those two things top the list. That is no surprise. We also know that mature programs are leveraging technology to overcome those challenges. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I would urge you to download this report. There's a control here on your screen on your dashboard where you may do so. We will also be emailing that report to all of our viewers today, along with the playback of this recording so that you can share it with your teams. Any final statements from our wonderful panelists? Thank you all for joining us today.
Look, I would just repeat what the report said. If you can invest in a benchmarking tool, like Juliana said, make sure you're enhancing your data literacy. Train people to use that and what data to look for. Make sure you're being transparent with your organization. Try, if you can, to focus on some of those emerging risks so you're getting ahead of things. And like Felipe said, engage across those generations. Make sure that you're addressing this and you're not just rolling your eyes.
Juliana, Anna, and Felipe, thank you so much for joining us today. Juliana, I've cut you off again. You had something to say.
No, I was going to say thank you so much for having us.
It's been a delight to engage in this conversation today. And thank you especially to LRN for this important research and adding to the body of knowledge that supports global compliance and risk. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
you.
everyone.